I feel many of us are brought up on unstated belief in the word progress. We assume the world's gonna get better. The technology is going to get better. Generally, GDP will increase. But beyond that, I feel we should be very cautious. Things can go terribly wrong. Many countries have gone terribly wrong. So I feel it is better to tell children a fairy tale where their technology will get better, but it could well be that their state gets worse. So, the progress of a society is something far more complex and should not be taken for granted. So, it's a very iffy thing. It's something to aspire for. We should dream of it, but we should not count on it.
Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm Amit. This is my good friend Ajay. And Ajay, I want to ask you a question. Just before we started, I asked you, where's that Buddha from? And you said your good friend Vijay Kelkar gifted it to you. And I want to ask you a question I've asked many people on the scene and the unseen, and I've thought about a bit, which is a question about friendship. Right? You have referred at various times to friends like Vijay Kelkar who are much older than you, friends like Ayush Patnaik who are much younger than you. And it seems that you are both extremely generous to your friends, which of course I've experienced, but you're also intentional about friendship in a certain way. That, you go out of your way to look after your friends, to kind of nurture a friendship. And most of us, we sort of drift through life letting things happen to us, taking things for granted, taking friends for granted, often not really thinking about stuff, not being mindful, and falling for that main character syndrome where you are like the main character in a play and everybody else is a prop for your amusement or for your distraction or whatever. And I struggle with this because that is actually my default mode where I am just immersed in myself, and I have to keep reminding myself that no, be intentional about this or that or whatever. So I want to ask you about friendship. How do you think about it? How has that concept evolved for you? How have friendships evolved for you?
It has evolved greatly. Uh, First, I just want to say that I have one huge edge over you, that I'm older than you. Okay, so these are things that just one figures out. It takes time. Okay, we have to be curious and skeptical and not self-obsessed, and then these things come. And I have understood deeply that actually the engagements with our few people are what is make and break on the scale of a life. And so over the years, I've just understood these things are very important, and I prioritize them and take effort on it. Uh, Nicholas Dunbar has this concept called Dunbar's number. He, he's famous as having observed that we are wired for about 150 human relationships, which correlates nicely with the size of a typical hunter-gatherer band. He also has these subclassifications of 5, 15, 50, and 150. So we have, roughly speaking, the mental and emotional capacity to have about 5 people deeply close, then about 15 people, then about 50, and then about 150. And I feel that we should all, try hard to make it work. Another little thought in that space is that no man walks in the same friendship twice. So sometimes it is a place and a time, a state of mind which just clicks, and it won't recur into the future. And now that I'm all grown up, I think that's okay. So if there was a finite window of time where everything clicked well, that's great. Count it as with much gratitude. And it can change, and it's not that you're a bad person or they are a bad person. It is just that the state of mind and the intellectual development and the emotional capacity evolves through the years. So age is just a number. I mean, for me, age is the least important thing. It's about the person. I mean, I know old people who are petty like children, who are self-centered and power hungry, and I know very young people who have learned to start letting go. So I think age is a very silly number to focus on, and some of the best friendships cut across the age differences.
And along with the Dunbar number of 150 people, there's also perhaps a cat number of 10 cats or whatever the number might be. We have a cat mewing in the background right now. So
Yeah.
I would like to urge our gentle readers that we are not being ungentle with creatures of any sort, human or otherwise. Cats mew, that's what they do. And I'm actually going to hijack this
Yeah.
episode a little bit because our first chapter was going to jump into the first globalization. We were going to talk about three globalizations,
Yeah.
but Dunbar's number reminded me of something, and I'm going to talk about that instead. So, the concept that I remember and I've spoken about quite often, and that came to me from Dunbar's number. And Dunbar's number was, of course, proposed as a higher bar that more than 150 people is hard for us. We evolved that way in hunter gatherer tribes. And there is a beautiful concept I love called the expanding circle. So, circa 1897, W.E.H. Lecky wrote a book called The History of European Morals, right? And in that book, he came up with the concept of the expanding circle. And here was his concept. He said that around us, we begin, like in human history, we begin with a circle of people to whom we extend our moral consideration. Everybody else is an other. They might as well be animals, right? We don't care about them. And initially, this circle is our family, right? And then it expands our family and friends. It might expand to the tribe. Then as you have agricultural societies or whatever and tribes come together, it might expand to more than that. And then it might expand to your nation. And then it might expand beyond that. And Lecky's point in 1897 was that it is an ever expanding circle through human history. That it begins with your family, your tribe, whatever, and soon more and more people begin to be people that you consider worthy of your moral consideration. And when you look at many of the horrors inflicted over history, the horror of slavery, for example, and today you sit and wonder that how could you do this to another human being? But the simple answer is that the circle of the people at that time hadn't expanded beyond their own kind or beyond their own skin color or whatever. You might argue that at one point the circle of people hadn't even expanded to women, perhaps, who were, looked upon as instrumental or etc. etc. And Peter Singer makes a great argument that actually, I think it's in his book Animal Liberation, I forget which book, but he makes this argument that this expanding circle should expand beyond humans and it should go to animals, which is his fervent case for animal rights and for sort of vegetarianism and so on and so forth. Though, as you and I could well argue that today, eating a plate of upma kills many, many, many more animals than eating a chicken, because the chicken there was one chicken involved, and But leaving all of that aside, I love the concept. I love the concept that just as Jefferson could keep slaves and feel that it was morally okay to do so, and we look back on him and say, oh, he kept slaves. 200 years later, people could look back on us and say that, oh, they ate animals. And I think that's going to happen once we get to that stage where we have the luxury of doing so. But I'm also reminded that the expanding circle doesn't always stay expanded, and in some cases might even contract. And I worry that in the last few years, where there is so much nationalism and there is so much virulence about various aspects of identity, that our circles are shrinking and not expanding, and that worries me greatly.
I want to say two things. One is that I feel many of us are brought up on unstated belief in the word progress. We assume the world's going to get better. The technology is going to get better. Generally, GDP will increase. But beyond that, I feel we should be very cautious. Things can go terribly wrong. Many, many countries have gone terribly wrong. So I feel it is better to tell children a fairy tale where their technology will get better, but it could well be that their state gets worse. So, the progress of a society is something far more complex and should not be taken for granted. So, it's a very iffy thing. It's something to aspire for. We should dream of it, but we should not count on it. The second thing I want to say is that I've actually been struck by the emergence of people like Mahavir and concepts like uh, Jainism in India. Because in that primitive society, it makes no functional sense at all. You're short of protein, you should be grabbing every scrap of protein that you can get. Okay, it is no golden age. So, contrary to some claims that are made about some mythical past where the where the streets were filled with cheese, right? Is that? But there are no cats in America, and the streets are filled with cheese. This is the kind of fable that the mice in Russia are told in a movie. So there was no mythical lost age where there was plenty and there was prosperity. And in that world, some people developed very advanced concepts and philosophies, and I really admire those people. And it I think that it tells me about something in the Indian society where there are remarkable intellectual and philosophical capabilities.
And it also tells me that there is perhaps long before the world can come together, long before globalization, there is a kind of globalization happening in this conceptual expanding circle. So, let's get down to the topic of our episode, the three globalizations.
So I want to talk about the three globalizations. First, let's just take the word globalization apart. All of us are a little jaded with the overuse of the word globalization. By the time a word graduates into the airport books, it surely stops making much sense. So I want to think carefully about what that word means and where it comes from. So globalization refers to a state where human beings have deep engagement with people across the border of the country. Okay, so the Westphalian state came along, but they can be deep engagements by people across borders. So even though there is a Westphalian state, it doesn't necessarily shape and circumscribe what human beings do. And globalization can take place in many dimensions. It can take place in a world of ideas. Ideas can flow freely across countries without getting into narrow sectarian conceptions of my idea and their idea, or that is a foreign idea. Ideas should be free, ideas should travel the whole world. Then globalization can take place in the movement of people, that in some ideal world, the state does not control the people and the people are able to move freely. And it is a measure of globalization, the extent to which people are able to move freely and the extent to which people do move. Then the third dimension is cross-border movement of goods. The fourth dimension is cross-border movement of services. The fifth dimension is cross-border movement of capital. Okay, so all these things can move across the border based on voluntary transactions by people. But the question is that, do states interfere with that? So first, I just want to say clearly that the term globalization refers to the extent to which these five things are not being shaped by a national border. Now we come to what causes all these kinds of globalizations. There are basically two stories at work. One story is the government. So when the modern nation state emerged, it took it upon itself to control its people, and the freedoms started being lopped away. So the freedom to move ideas from one country to another is often contested by states which would like to push a particular propaganda narrative that is convenient for the state. The state is always the simple definition. The state is the community that achieves and maintains a monopoly of physical violence in a given territory. That's the state is a game of how to coerce the society. So the state may find it efficient to push certain kinds of ideology. There will be an official ideology, there will be some official religion, and then the state may try to proscribe other ideologies, other religions, other kinds of knowledge from coming into the country. You have banned books, you can have banned ideas, and so on. Then states can interfere with the movement of people. So very early on, states got into the game of giving every individual a number and putting up a checkpost at the border saying you can leave, you cannot leave, you can come in, you cannot come in. So states got into the game of controlling the movement of their own people, and this only started at the time of the First World War. The third piece of idea is the movement of goods. Once again, the simple natural state is where you may phone a friend in Mozambique and say, hey dude, can I buy some ball bearings from you? And he says, sure, and he ships over the ball bearings. But then the state comes in the middle and says, no, I will not allow the movement of ball bearings, or you have to report all that movement of ball bearings to me, or you have to pay customs duties to me. Okay.
So imagine you have two friends. One of them is in Mozambique and he has ball bearings he wants to sell you. And another one is in Pune and he also has ball bearings he wants to sell you. And you're sitting in Mumbai, right? Why? And this is a question, why is it so much harder for the friend in Mozambique, apart from the physical distance, to send you those ball bearings, right? And that's my question at a philosophical level. Why should it be hard?
Yeah. And the last dimension is capital. Capital can move freely across the border, but the state interferes. It says, I know better. I will prevent this kind of capital from moving across the border. Or only equity capital can move, but debt capital cannot move, or sometimes the other way around. Or there are actual capital controls in India where poultry farms and nanotechnology can engage in foreign borrowing, but others cannot. Okay, so there is this intricate government control of capital. So these are the
So if
five.
you're a really small chicken, you have the best of both worlds: poultry farms and nanotechnology.
Yeah, a
Sorry,
nano
carry
chicken.
on. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are ways in which the state interferes in the natural freedoms of people to do things as they like. The other dimension is technology. The emergence of computer technology, the emergence of transportation technology has made a world of a difference. Realistically, in the olden days, you could not move ball bearings from Mozambique to India. But now the cost of container ships, the cost of air freight, all these things have become cheap. And I already touched upon how services exports has been made possible by telecom. Okay, so this is the big picture of globalization, where globalization is defined as the concept of freely doing large volumes of cross border activity. It is shaped by governments that may seek to interfere with the natural freedoms of people or the freedoms of natural persons. And it is shaped by technology. And as the technology gets better, you're able to do more things spanning distance. It's about the depth of distance. Okay, so these are the basics of the facts around globalization. Okay, and from this perspective, I want to describe a period in world history that is called the first globalization. We had touched upon this in the context of the Indian journey. There was an episode around the story of India, the economic history of India, where the first globalization figures in an important way. But that basic story is this, that the emergence of steamships and the Suez Canal and the telegraph was a revolution for the extent of globalization. Because now people across the United States and the UK and India started moving messages and money and transporting cotton and cotton cloth and so on. This kind of first rise of trade took place, and that was the first globalization. It's important to remember that in the first globalization, nation states were not in the game. They were not doing anything. The people were free. So the people were free to travel without passports and visas. Capital was free to move. Goods were moving. Services were moving in a very limited way. But a service provider could move. You could be a lawyer and go to London and practice. Okay, those kinds of things. So it was a world of extreme freedom for the people. The states were not in the game. It was really technology constrained. So the limitations were of the steamships and the planes or the lack of planes and so on. So the first globalization is a bit of a paradise in terms of free people exercising their rights and doing whatever they
The
want.
constraint is mobility and technology, which hasn't gotten to where it is today.
So there was a very interesting and important feature in the first globalization, which is called capital moving downhill. The richest place in the world at that time, the financial center of the whole world, was London. Okay. Now, when you go to other countries of the world, the United States, Argentina, India, these are poor countries where the rates of return on capital were very high. So there was no great value in building one more factory or one more road in the UK. The UK was an advanced economy. But the marginal product, the return on equity, the rates of return from building infrastructure and building factories in the US or in Venezuela, sorry, or Argentina or Venezuela or India was substantially high. And in the first globalization, capital actually moved downhill. That the projects all over the world went to London to raise money. And then that money went to India, went to Argentina, went to the United States for doing productive investment. And that was again the best of all worlds. That you got cheap capital at the advanced economies where there was so much capital already in use in the economy that the marginal returns of one more unit of capital being used there was relatively low. Whereas when you went into developing countries like the United States, there were very big gains by putting 1 rupee of capital, and so the marginal product was higher. So this was a nice feature of the first globalization. There is a beautiful quotation by John Maynard Keynes where he describes the life that was prevalent in the early 20th century, where you could be living in a city and getting goods from all over the world delivered to your doorstep. It was a world of participating in activities all over the world without restriction. Okay, so that was the first globalization.
And this quote would be around 1911, 1912,
Yeah,
I'm
I think
guessing.
it was 1912. All this went to hell with the First World War and the Russian Revolution. So the rise of nationalism really destroyed the first globalization. At the time of the First World War, passports came about. At the time of the First World War, the British brought about a naval blockade of Germany, and to a significant extent, the cross border movement of goods was adversely affected. To some extent, German submarines were shooting at cargo ships, and that made transportation and insurance more expensive. So, all hell broke loose at the time of the first globalization. But I also want to tell amazing stories of that period. Uh, have you heard of Polsen butter?
No?
Okay, you're clearly showing your age. People of my age, we know Polsen butter. Polsen was a British company that was built in India, that grew up and became very successful in India, because at the time of the First World War, the British Army wanted to buy vast amounts of butter. And Polson built the first milk supply chain from Gujarat to make butter and send it by train to Bombay, and from where it was sent up to the UK. So Gujarat was producing milk 100 years ago that was being delivered as Polson butter into the British war effort. Okay, so these were the kinds of things that happened out of the first
I
globalization.
want to take a break here.
Yeah.
I have to take a break here. This is a
Okay.
story. Every time it comes into my head, I have to tell it to someone. Otherwise, my brain will explode.
Yeah.
Okay, circa 1980s, right? There is a department in the Tamil Nadu government called CCA.
Yeah.
And this department applies for a rise in its budget, saying for a long time its budget has remained stagnant. So some enterprising bureaucrat decides to find out ki what is this CCA and what do they do, right? And then they go back in time, and this is happening in the 80s, and they go back in time, and they discover that something terrible happened in the Second World War. I mean, many terrible things happened in the Second World War, but one of them was that Winston Churchill, who was a fan of cigars, suddenly could not get his favorite cigars from Cuba because the supply lines were cut, right? So his second favorite cigars, and this is a matter of great pride to us Indians, that the second best cigars in the world after Cuba were from this place in Tamil Nadu. And because I cannot pronounce the name, I won't offend my Tamil friends, but it was a town in Tamil Nadu which had the second best cigars in the world. So a supply was set up because India at that time still part of the British Empire. A supply was set up, and in whatever the British government there was called at the time, a department was set up which would supply cigars to Winston Churchill from Tamil Nadu, and that department was called CCA, Churchill Cigar Assistant, right? And World War II ended. Winston Churchill died. India gained independence, not in that order. A whole bunch of shit happens. And all the way to the 1980s, that government department still exists called the CCA, and the person in it has the audacity to say we need more budgets. So this is one of the great stories. I think I got it from a book by Vivek Debroy to, give credit where it is due. And it's a fantastic story. And there you go, global supply chains. I'm sorry, continue. Now I had to get this out of the way.
Okay. Every time you tell one fun, unrelated story, do I get the license to do likewise?
Kindly,
Okay, because I'm bubbling with a large supply of nonsense stories.
kindly tell.
Okay, I want to continue on Polson.
Okay.
Okay, so after the Second World War, Polson turned around and started serving the Indian market. Sorry, after the First World War, Polson turned around and was serving the Indian market, and they were a dominant butter producer all the way into the 60s and the early 70s. As a child, I have eaten Polson butter. Okay, so I have actually seen boxes of Polson butter being sold in India. Now, then came Amul. So the great man Kurian, the cooperative movement in Gujarat, with a great deal of technical and financial support, I believe, from the Economic Development Aid Agency of Denmark. Okay, started putting new machines, new process designs into building the milk supply chain in Gujarat around Amul. They first made beautiful high quality milk. They sent it, sorry, butter, and sent it down refrigerated vans to Bombay for sale. Okay, so good Danish technology every step of the way, chilling plants, all the good stuff. And the Bombay consumers said, this doesn't work. We hate this butter. Okay, so people loved Polson butter and they hated the first batches of Amul butter. And then there was a careful exploration about what was going on. And the answer is that in those years, refrigeration on the train was no good. So on the way from Gujarat to Bombay, the Polson butter would become a little rancid. And the tastes of the Bombay consumer had become programmed to expect butter to taste a little rancid. So when the first clean, perfect Amul butter made with Danish machines and good refrigeration first landed in Bombay, the Bombay consumers said, "This is bland, dull butter. It doesn't have the punch of butter." And so Amul butter first sold in Bombay was a complete flop
Because it was too good.
because it was too good. And then the scientists came to the rescue. They figured out the exact chemicals that are formed when butter goes rancid. And then those chemicals were artificially introduced into Amul butter. And I do not know whether they persist to this day. But this is how Amul butter took off in Bombay. And that's how they drove Polson bankrupt and Polson went out of business.
They made it rancid deliberately, and I have a counter story to your story. Let's see where that takes us. Which is that when the iPod was first introduced, right, it had a random feature that it would just play songs at random. And some people began to complain that, boss, mere favorite artist ka bar bar aata rehta hai. It is surely not a coincidence. It should be random, but I got 6 Bruce Springsteens in a row. That cannot be random.
But
And
that's
whatever.
because people don't understand randomness.
Correct. And the thing is, the law of truly large numbers, given a long enough number of iterations, any unlikely thing will happen, including 6 Bruce Springsteen songs in a row. So how Apple dealt with this complaint was by introducing an algorithm which made it non-random, which got in the way of the randomness and made sure that if something was appearing non-random, it would just be changed, right? To make it appear random and not actually random. So what a mind-blowing story.
Okay. One last story before I get back to second globalization.
Yes, sir, go for it.
Okay. So a run is when a coin generates heads in a row.
Yeah.
Okay. A run in a stock is when the price goes up 3 days in a row, up 4 days in a row, and so on. In statistics, there is a term that is called the runs test, which looks at the ratios of the various runs, the relative proportions of how often various runs happen to test for randomness. So you look at the number of times a stock goes up for 1 day in a row, 2 days in a row, ... goes down for 1 day in a row, 2 days in a row, 3 days in a row, ... And by taking in all this data, the runs test is able to tell you, is this randomness or is it something non-random? So if somebody had taken the original Steve Jobs iPod and taken data for the occurrences of the songs and fed it to the runs test, then he would have got an objective statement. Apple, you are lying. This is not randomness.
This is not randomness. We have to do an episode on poker, which will come out shortly. But while I wrote a poker column for the Economic Times, I think I wrote it for more than a year. One of them had the headline "Unlikely is Inevitable," where I was talking about just this: that the most incredible unlikely things happen. You get into a hand 80% favorite, you lose 5 hands like that in a row, and you say, "Ki, arre, it's rigged." But the point is, given a large enough sample size, those
things
bad
will
runs
happen.
will happen. They are sort of inevitable.
Okay, back to globalization.
Back to globalization.
Yeah. Sorry, dear reader, we just can't resist doing this Antakshari. So you do Antakshari as in, I'll tell a story, you'll take the last syllable of that, and then you'll tell a story. How's
Done?
that?
That's easy. We should actually do that someday. One whole episode should be that. Gentle reader, kindly don't unsubscribe right now. And if you haven't subscribed already, kindly subscribe and like. This is the time. Carry on.
Okay, so all hell broke loose with the First World War. There were interruptions in goods trade. There were interruptions in the movements of people. Shortly after that, Germany collapsed into the Nazi party. Nazi is German for nationalist socialist. So when Hitler wanted to go after the Jews, he brought about the first capital controls in the world. So now, for the first time, people had limitations on moving their money across the border. This had never happened before in world history. And the state of international trade and everything was in deep trouble till 1945. Okay, now in 1945, after the Second World War, there was a new international organizations architecture that was built, comprising the GATT, the General Agreement on
Tariffs and trade. Something like that.
trade, and the World Bank and the IMF. And this was architected by John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. You have mentioned C.D. Deshmukh. He was part of those negotiations in those days.
Chintaman Bhai.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, Keynes once wanted Chintaman Deshmukh as first managing director of the
of the
IMF, but the
IMF.
Americans got in the way and said, "What Indian fellow? What are you talking?" So,
Now, in that, Keynes made a trade. He chose a design. Okay. Right now, I don't want to comment on the sanity of the design. He chose. He chose a game where countries would more or less keep the exchange rates fixed. Okay. He felt that during the Great Depression, floating exchange rates had worked poorly. So he said that in order to promote trade, we should remove the fluctuations of the exchange rates and remove the incentives for governments to manipulate their own exchange rates. That was his view on how to stabilize the behavior of governments and create conditions for free trade so that there'll be more and more trade because the currency is not on your mind, that you're guaranteed a number for the exchange rate between the Great Britain pound and the US dollar, and you just focus on your business and figure out how to do more and more import and export. And Keynes intuitively knew a result which many years later was actually a Nobel Prize winning result. Okay, so there is a result that came much later, and I don't want to make this too geeky, but right now I just want to say that there is a fact that Keynes intuitively understood back in 1945. He was such a great man. He intuitively knew these things. He knew that you can't manage the exchange rate and have an open capital account. Okay, he knew it instinctively. It was formalized much later. The intuition was formalized much later, and it generated one Nobel Prize. And it's a fundamental building block of modern macroeconomics. But Keynes got the intuition. So the trade that Keynes and Harry Dexter White made was that we'll have fixed exchange rates, but we will coerce the people. We will shut off the natural freedoms of the people to move capital across the border. So that was the design of the post-Second World War period. And so globalization after the Second World War was much more muted. The movement of people was screwed up. The movement of capital was screwed up. Goods trade resumed back to 1913 conditions. The ships were better. Air freight came. Okay, so this was the recovery of international trade and globalization after the Second World War. And it started growing nicely, and gradually many things started getting better. But there is an astonishing fact that all of us should remember, that many metrics, most notably the trade GDP ratio, only got back to 1913 levels in 1982. Wow. Can you imagine that? The world only got back to the globalization of 1913 in 1982. And in 1982, it was a bit of a pale shadow because for many countries, capital account mobility was gone. There were capital controls. And because the movement of people was less good than 1913. So in a very fundamental way, we lost freedom from 1913 to 1982, or maybe even a bit beyond. Okay, so that is the long, dark chapter where nation states ruled the world, and nation states said, I will control your freedom. And they interfered in the freedoms of natural persons. And so we got to the great second globalization. Many things went right. The container ships came about. They were a revolution in generating a good decline in the cost of transportation by sea. The wide body airlines got better. The wide body aircraft got better, and the cost of transportation by air went down. The computers and telecom got started. So we started doing services, trade activities all over the world. There was the beginning of the breakdown of the system of John Maynard Keynes. So countries started abandoning their fixed exchange rates, got to a market-determined exchange rate, and then side by side with that, the capital controls started coming out. So we got to movement of capital. We got to a great restoration of the freedoms of the people within Europe in the form of the European Union, where visa-free travel began, where you could just get into a bus and move from one city to another across national borders. It was a restoration of the natural freedoms of the people that prevailed before the First World War. So there was something spectacular that happened, and it started getting to big numbers in the post-82 period. As I said, we only got back to the numbers of 1913 in certain metrics by 1982. And of course, this had very valuable impacts on human welfare, on prosperity. And I could say this in a couple of ways. One fancy way is to play the world of David Ricardo and trade theory, that cross-border trade always increases welfare, and it doesn't have to be that you are good at one thing and I'm bad at you are good at one thing and I'm good at another thing, and we do trade, but rather there has got to be a difference in the ratio between how much better you are as compared to me in two different things. So, under almost all real world conditions, Ricardian trade theory showed us how trade works better.
I want to simplify it for our listeners. This is, of course, called comparative advantage. And here's the idea: I am a better podcaster than you. I am also a better economist than you. However, I do the podcasting and I let you do the economics because, hey, I can't spend all my time doing economics. So, yeah,
That's
comparative. I'm
gains from
kidding.
trade.
Obviously, is better. Both, obviously. But
Yeah,
yeah.
gains from trade. Then I will also say this in a different way. I'll go from first principles of public economics. What is the idea? The idea is that freedom works. Freedom works well, except when there's a market failure, in which case you need to generally classify it into one of the four categories of market failure and think it through clearly. Is there asymmetric information? Is there an externality? Is there a public good? Okay, like that, you need to be clear that you've got a market failure in your hands, and then maybe a state intervention is justifiable. Now, it's so clear when a private voluntary transaction is taking place to buy ball bearings from Mozambique. There is no market failure. So, when a state intervenes in that, it is harming and not helping.
And
So,
in our episode on I think in our episode on Bastia and Hayek, we pointed out that every tariff like that, like if the government says I want to protect your friend in Pune, so I will put a tariff on ball bearing imports from Mozambique. What you're actually doing is you're redistributing wealth from the poor to the rich, from the poor consumers at large to the rich interest groups, which is saying tariff dalo block them.
or I want to use public economics reasoning that when the state intervenes in the absence of a market failure, it has an adverse impact on welfare. It has an adverse impact on GDP. So if you think of world GDP and the state is doing all these interference where there is no market failure, the state is harming world GDP. And in the second globalization, one by one, when the state got out of all those interventions, global GDP blossomed.
And I think about this like, along the axis of consent and coercion, right? All voluntary trade, it's a voluntary actions of two people. You and I trade, we are both better off. That is, mutual consent. Consent wins, GDP grows. But if there is coercion by the state, not letting you and me trade, the benefits that both of you could have had because it's a positive sum game, they don't happen. So coercion always takes you into a vicious cycle. Cooperation and consent can bring you out of that vicious cycle. And I love the way you've defined freedom through this episode by pointing out that freedom is a natural state where adults are engaging with each other through voluntary trade, and it is states that get in the way and are the enemies of freedom.
So that was the second globalization. It was a revolution. It was a miracle. It was something beautiful. The scale at which technologies of transportation enabled the movement of people, the movement of bits, was unprecedented, and it created great prosperity. All over the world, countries benefited enormously. India has been a gigantic beneficiary. The entire software revolution, the services exports revolution was made possible through globalization. So India's progress is very much linked to plugging into this world of globalization. Okay, so that's the second globalization.
So, in the literature before, I've come across the first globalization, the second globalization. However, the third globalization is a term coined by you. So, explain to me what you mean by this.
In the recent years, many odd things have happened, many strange things have happened. So, first, I just want to catalog them, then, I want to describe a mainstream view of them, then, I want to be a little more precise, and then man is the highest animal, man does the classifying, man does the naming.
Humans.
So, humans. Okay, humans do the naming. Over the last few years, we've seen a very remarkable set of developments. Here are examples. There was a Chinese organization which tried to buy certain businesses in the United States, and the United States government cited national security concerns and blocked that transaction. So that is a non-globalization world where national security considerations got in the way. Dubai Ports World wanted to buy a port in America, and the United States government interfered with that transaction. Then we've had remarkable sanctions that have been imposed. There was a whole field that is called economic statecraft, okay, which is about these kinds of using state power to interfere with the working of the economy. Economic statecraft has done remarkable things such as step one, blocking the sale of certain kinds of CPUs and GPUs to China. Okay, so there is a clear bright line number. I seem to remember 600 megabits a second of data transfer in and out of a GPU is the max that is allowed for sale to China. If a GPU can move more data than that, then it cannot be sold into China. Okay, this is a completely new development where United States exports control says we will not allow the sale of these kinds of powerful chips to China. A little before that, something even more remarkable happened. One of the great companies in the world is called ASML. ASML is a Dutch company, and they are the world leader in making the machines that make the CPUs. Okay, so they are the first people who figured out how to get to 5 nanometers, 3 nanometer processes. Just to make sure that your mind is blown, a 2 nanometer process is a track 2 nanometers wide on a computer chip, and 2 nanometers happens to be the thickness of 10 atoms of silicon. So we are counting individual atoms of silicon when we say 2 nanometers. Okay, that's the craziness of what's happening there. ASML makes these machines, and these machines are considered the most complex technology in the whole world today.
I have a question for you. When these atoms brush up against each other and that results in a sort of a sensual kind of organic sound, what is it called?
I don't know.
ASMR by ASML. Sorry, kindly continue.
So ASML is a Dutch company that makes these machines. I think they go for about 150 to 200 million dollars a pop, each machine, and they make about 200 of them every year. So they're an artisanal shop that makes, about one such machine every day. Of course, there's a long process that leads to shipping one machine every day, and each of these machines costs some $150 million, $200 million. I think I have some numbers wrong. Not one a day, one a week or something. This is a Dutch company. Some years ago, the United States and the European governments got together and told ASML, we will not allow you to sell this machine to Chinese buyers.
Wow.
Okay, that is a new place. Normally, in the early years, China, India could buy any machine from abroad, and there was never a restriction on buying these machines. So these are new kinds of restrictions.
So this
that
is
have
the
come
American
about.
government telling a Dutch businessman.
Collaborating with European governments. Everybody is
So
aligned around the
American
same
and
idea.
European governments are
Coming
telling
together.
a Dutch businessman,
Correct.
don't sell this machine
They're
to a Chinese
coercing the
person.
Dutch businessman, saying even though you have a private voluntary transaction, somebody in China is willing to pay you good money for that machine, but we coerce you, we will prevent you from selling. Okay, that's a remarkable and new development. Okay, American export controls don't stop there. If a certain chip can't be sold by an American seller to a Chinese buyer, American export controls cut deeply. Now you can't indirectly be involved in the production of that chip in any way. So any associated companies cannot do business with Chinese buyers. So there's a very sweeping rubric around who cannot do those transactions. I mean, of course, if you're an Indian company and you sell that chip to a Chinese buyer and United States intelligence finds out, you'll come under American sanctions, which means that the key persons of that company are potentially going to get arrested when they fly into America.
What jurisdiction? What jurisdiction? does
American
America
jurisdictions.
have?
They're saying if you want to travel to America, then we will arrest you. You can do whatever you like.
Wow.
Okay, this is an amazing world of export control that has sprung up. First, I just want to describe it, then I want to dig into more about what is going on. First, I just want to describe these kinds of trade restrictions are actually happening. This was the first part of the journey of worrying about the Chinese emergence into high tech. And as we discussed in the China episode, Xi Jinping's nationalism and hostility to the West was sufficiently strong, and that the advanced economies of the world got together and said, no, we're not going to do business with you. So earlier, globalization was handed to China on a platter. Globalization was handed to India on a platter. But all the things I'm describing show the world was not willing to allow that to go on. Okay, it gets worse. Then came the Russia war. After Russia invaded Ukraine, another wave of hair-raising elements of economic statecraft began. The advanced economies created rules whereby they grabbed the foreign exchange reserves belonging to the Russian central bank. So there was about $600 billion of capital belonging to the balance sheet of the Russian central bank, which was sitting all over the advanced economies because there is no other place to keep money. And they grabbed this money when the war started, saying, we will not hesitate in using every economic lever. Then, of course, sale of all kinds of military materials or complicated integrated circuits, etc., to Russia was blocked. Chinese companies were threatened that if you sell military grade materials to Russia, then we will bring sanctions against you. And there have been a couple of Chinese companies that have come on the sanctions list. So a whole array of instruments have come into play in economic statecraft. Similarly, there is a global payment system that is called SWIFT. All the transactions of the world happen on SWIFT, and many Russian entities were cut off from participating in SWIFT. Okay, so all these kinds of restrictions have come in. It's a whole new world. It has never happened before. The logic on the part of the advanced economies was that it is morally superior to do economic restrictions rather than spill blood. Okay, so their logic is, we want to do everything we can to make sure that Russia will lose in Ukraine. There are two ways to do it. One way to approach it is to say all the economic engagement will continue, all the globalization is fine, but we will use guns and soldiers to fight in Ukraine, which means fundamentally that more people die. Or choke Russia using economic statecraft, and you get the same objective done while fewer people die. And they argued that morally it is superior to use economic tools rather than using bullets. Okay, this is the kind of logic that was done. So these are all the developments that have happened in the recent period. I also want to describe a few more things. Many countries, most notably the United States, have started putting public money into their own countries to foster certain kinds of high tech, which they're always entitled to. Any country is entitled to use public money to foster R&D, but they have some interesting limitations. Okay, the text of that limitation is just outright remarkable. It says that any company that gets money from the United States subsidy program for doing advanced semiconductor research cannot build any new facilities in China. Just imagine, if you're going to get a public subsidy in America, you may have some old established activities in China, but we forbid you, that a clause you're signing on to is that if you take public money for innovation expenditures in America, we're getting a subsidy to do R&D from the exchequer. It comes with a condition that now you will not build a new factory in China. Okay, these kinds of restrictions have emerged, and they're a whole new game. Okay, so I just wanted to describe these array of levers. Things that were considered unimaginable in the second globalization have started happening. Okay, and it's no longer trivial stuff like a ban on imports or customs tariffs or a capital control. This is the way the old world used to work. This is not the way the new world works.
I'd kind of call it an anti-globalization, but you're saying it's a kind of globalization.
So I'm going to go further into that. Right now, I just wanted to describe it. And precisely as you say, there's a whole variety of people who have been writing. This proves that globalization is dead. Okay, so people are ready to say globalization, RIP. It is over, it is gone. And now we are in some strange world. Nationalism rules supreme. Governments are back on top. This is one interpretation that has been widely noted. And I've thought a lot about it, and I don't think so. Okay, so let's go under the skin of what is being done, and let's think more about what is going on. What the advanced economies of the world, so people loosely use the word the West, but Japan is an Asian country. Taiwan is an Asian country. South Korea is an Asian country. So I think it's the club of the advanced economies of the world that add up to 65-70% of world GDP. These countries see eye to eye, and they are collaborating in all these matters. What the advanced economies of the world are saying is that we look back into history. We gave globalization on a platter to everybody in the second globalization. Whether you were Russia or China or India, we never asked questions about your behavior on any other respect. We just said, come unconditionally integrate into the world of globalization. It's going to be good for everybody. We felt confident that as you become rich, you will inevitably stop beating your wife. Okay, so there was this confidence that, yeah, there will be various stupid things now and then, but by and large, the arc of history goes in only one direction. Today, people are in a mood to wake up and say, no, we're no longer that sure that it doesn't go only in one direction. They have watched how Deng Xiaoping's China and all the hope that China would actually mature into a capable liberal democracy have been dashed, and China has become more authoritarian than it ever was. They have watched how Gorbachev's Russia has turned into Putin's Russia. So there are no guarantees on these things. And then it can turn into explicit violence. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Xi Jinping regularly does saber rattling, trying to promise that he will invade Taiwan. Okay, there's no telling. China has regularly done military damage on the Indian border. So, when a country is in that kind of militaristic, nationalistic place, and what is more, as we have discussed in the previous episode, when the working of the Chinese economy and the Chinese society is in trouble, starting a war is a good distraction. Okay, it has been done through world history. One of the reasons Putin invaded Ukraine was because the entire Putin project around the Russian economy had come to a stall. The economy was not moving, the economy was not growing, the young men were becoming angry, they were unemployed. What better way to overcome these problems than by starting a war? Then you get to talk nationalism, militarism, rally everybody around the flag. The moment you say soldier, soldier, everybody falls in line and says, oh yes, we support my country. I will always stand with my country. I remember one good friend of ours who said something remarkable to me, and I hope he will not be offended because I am disagreeing with him remotely when I did not instantly have the wit to disagree with him on the spot. He was describing some scholar working for a Western think tank in Moscow. And when the war started, he resigned from the Western think tank because he wanted to stand by his country. And I just wanted to say that there is always a difference between a country and a state. They're two different things. Standing by your country is not standing by the state. The state is capable of doing many things, and there is no need to conflate the two. They're two different
The
problems.
people who best illustrated this was that whole cohort of Russian chess players who, right after the invasion, came out with a letter against Vladimir Putin opposing the war. And in my mind, all of them stood up for their country.
Correct.
Right? And many of them they're playing for other countries because they can't enter Russia anymore. But that is bravery and that is patriotism.
So all these things have happened, and it could easily get worse. The possibility of China invading Taiwan is not over. It could happen. China, the Chinese government, the Chinese state. So again, I want to never mix up the Chinese people and the Chinese state. The Chinese people are wonderful. I have absolutely nothing against them. The Chinese state has done crazy levels of saber rattling, military exercises, blood curdling promises. They say that if Taiwan declares independence, then we will invade. Like, excuse me, this is a free country. They can do whatever they like. So in the eyes of the advanced economies, these are now turning into rogue states. And as with Iran and North Korea, the idea that is being evolved is that there will be a world of globalization between countries where certain minimum standards of fair play and behavior are satisfied. And when a country invades a neighbor, as Russia did to Ukraine, then the level of economic difficulties that will come upon that country can be pretty unlimited. This toolkit has been assembled, and this toolkit has been used against Russia and China. That doesn't mean that globalization is dead. For everybody else, globalization is great. If you're Japan, globalization is great. If you're Dubai, globalization is great. Everything is working. If you're India, globalization is great. There have been absolutely no limitations against Indian participation in the world compared to 5 years ago on movement of people, movement of goods, movement of services, movement of capital. Okay, everything is working fine. So it's not true that globalization is dead. Globalization is alive and well. It is in fact deepening year after year. The basic forces that drove globalization, which is that double thank you moment, the transaction between two people across the border where you are thrilled and I am thrilled that, hey, we got a deal and both of us are better from the deal. That is intact. The improvements in technology whereby we are able to move bits and people and goods more frictionlessly than ever before. That is alive and well. We are getting better and better at doing all that. The immense rise of what is called other business services on the Indian balance of payments that took place after COVID is testimony to that. COVID was a moment for every global corporation to understand that it actually works if my people are at home and never show up to work. But then the logical next step is to say, hey, then why don't I hire somebody in India? I'm better off hiring somebody in India. Why would I pay a New York salary to a person when a guy in India has identical capability? This is a whole new phase in globalization, and that is alive and well, and that is going strong. So I have a simple terminology around this. I want to call this the third globalization. Okay, so there was a first globalization where everything was free. Then there was one long nightmare that went to 82. From 1982 to about 2016-17, there was a great resumption of globalization, which was pretty unconditional. China was told, you're welcome in this club, no matter who you are. Vladimir Putin kept murdering people in London, but you're welcome to globalization. Okay. Now comes the third globalization, where a certain kind of amity has been made a precondition. You can't be a rogue state. That rogue states are not welcome. Everybody else is in a club, and that club is doing more globalization than ever before. So it's not true that globalization is dead, but the perimeter has shrunk. So only about 85% of world GDP is now doing globalization, but 85% of world GDP is pretty much everything. And about 15% of world GDP is sitting in countries who are being proscribed in various ways. Some people are very angry about all these developments, and they resent the power of the advanced economies to interfere with central bank deposits, to interfere with SWIFT, to interfere with the ability to buy a machine from ASML. Okay, all these things are seen with great resentment. And an angry emotional response is that, no, hell with you, we will now build something new through which we will be able to do our own globalization beyond the reach of the economic statecraft of the advanced economies. And maybe we should do a full episode on this one day, but I just want to say this is not realistically possible. There is no coalition of countries that can build a currency that will rival the dollar and the euro. There is no coalition of countries that can meaningfully build a pathway to exchange rates and foreign exchange reserves that does not involve a dominant role for the dollar and the euro. There is no meaningful pathway to building a payment system of any materiality that is disconnected from the dollar and the euro. So my candid assessment is that you need to make up your mind about whether you want to get angry about this or not. Okay, I don't particularly get angry. I'm an Indian patriot. Our journey is to make India a great country. There are rules of the game. Don't invade your neighbor. I think, we in India are unlikely to want to conquer Bangladesh. Okay, so I think that there's a certain participation in rules of the game. India is a status quo power. India is not China, where they seek to overthrow the global order, and Russia seeks to invade Ukraine and China seeks to invade Taiwan. That's not what India is doing anyway. So I'm not fussed about the handcuffs that are being put upon every country as part of the third globalization. For the rest, the third globalization is an open invitation to participate in globalization, and India is doing it every day. So there may be some kind of rhetoric by some people, but for all practical purposes, this is the life India is leading every day. And I will borrow a piece of advice from the great man Deng Xiaoping, which is bide your time. Okay, for 100 years, our journey is to become an advanced economy and a democracy. Then one can rethink the world at that future date. I expect 100 years from now, India will be a great country like Japan, like Taiwan, like South Korea. We will have full amity and collaboration with the advanced economies of the world because we will be an advanced economy ourselves.
So, you've spoken about economics, you've spoken about geopolitics. I will introduce a third angle: babysitters. Ask me how.
Babysitters?
Yeah. On December 10th, 2005, there was an excellent column in the Financial Times by Tim Harford called My Trade Deficit with My Babysitter. right? And the column made a beautiful point, and I'll tell you why I'm doing this. I'm getting to a question for you and sort of a little bit of a lament as well. But Harvard's point was that people who talk about trade deficits don't know their arm from their elbow. Right? He's saying that look at the relationship between me and my babysitter. I pay her all the time. I buy her services all the time. She buys nothing from me. It is completely one-sided. If you think of us, as if we were countries, you would say, "Oh, there's a trade deficit. There is a problem." But actually, it's two individuals transacting to mutual benefit, and it doesn't really matter. And that is why a fiscal deficit, now that's a problem. A trade deficit is not a problem, especially in a bilateral sense. If you say, "Oh, India has a trade deficit with China. We buy more from them than they buy from us." I'm like, number one, that's fantastic, and number two, that is not the truth. It's not India buying from China. It is Indians, individuals buying from Chinese individuals or companies to the mutual benefit of both of them. Every trade leaves both of them better off, and therefore, by extension, it leaves India better off, it leaves China better off. So you'll see this political rhetoric from both sides that, oh, trade deficits are a bad thing and we need to do something about them. And my argument is no, trade deficits isn't even something that we should consider. Individuals are transacting, it doesn't matter which way the balance goes. And the reason I mention this is that the conceptual mistake people who complain about trade deficits make is that they're thinking in terms of nations and abstracting it to the level of nations and not thinking at the level of individuals. And even here, when I think about globalizations, like you pointed out, the second globalization was individuals transacting with each other and nation states getting in the way. And what I see happening here in the third globalization, which you've laid out so eloquently, is that it is nation states thinking about their own interests. Now, at one level, if I'm thinking from the unit of a nation state, I can say, yeah, Russia bad, China kind of bad, America's got to do what it's got to do, etc., etc. Everything is justified. On the other hand, I am looking at the Russian people who are suffering because of this. I am looking at the Chinese people who are suffering because of this. And it's fine if 85% of the world can take part, but the 15% who can't take part, I don't see that 15% as rogue nations. I think of them as unfortunate people who happen to be in countries which have rogue regimes, and they are getting punished for this. And I feel disquiet about that, because I think the average Russian patriot who loves his country, who is not fond of what Putin is doing, is also not being able to get his McDonald's burger, which is perhaps a bad example, because you could argue the McDonald's burger is not great for you, but you know what I mean, right? And that is a one aspect of this that makes me feel like it is a step backwards from the second globalization.
There's no question about that, but I just want to clarify. By no feat of imagination has there been any large impact on Chinese trade. We're only discussing a few specialized things. We're discussing military equipment. As I said, GPUs and AI chips made about 3 years ago are fully fine. It is just today's latest state-of-the-art, amazing AI chips that can't be sold to
But
Chinese
why
buyers.
should the Chinese gamer not have access to the latest GPU and
These
the
are
latest
way
chip?
beyond anything a gamer will want. These are things to develop LLMs and image processing for satellite imagery.
So
and
I
so
could
on.
be an AI researcher in China and want these.
Correct.
Why
And
not?
if you're an AI researcher in China, this is a catastrophe. Your entire career is destroyed
Yeah.
because you will not be at the edge of what is possible. As I said, the proponents of this kind of economic statecraft will argue that it is better to do this ugliness than killing
down
people
completely.
when a war comes. That Xi Jinping was well on his way to launch an invasion to Taiwan. Okay, partly what the world has shown when Putin invaded Ukraine is designed for an audience of one, that is Xi Jinping. That don't you dare invade Taiwan, don't you dare do really bad things with India to a point where you will provoke more countries of the world. Okay, so this is just great. And the trade-off, your moral calculus, is between the deaths of soldiers and civilians versus the career destruction for an AI researcher in China. Okay, and there's no question that that's a bad thing. Surrounding what you described as the voluntary transactions of individuals, it's what you say is precisely correct. It is individuals, it is firms that do trade, not countries that do trade. So in $100 billion of trade are 100 million double thank you moments. There are people on both sides who are delighted. Okay, the importer is saying to his girlfriend, I got such a great deal. We are buying these dirt cheap things from China. And the Chinese exporter is telling her boyfriend, I got a great deal from India. We're selling stuff that is so expensive to somebody in India. Okay, there's these double thank you
At
moments.
least everyone has a good romantic life in your stories. Carry on.
Yeah. I just want to go two steps further on trade deficits. There's a little bit of economics geekery I would love to please sell to everybody. When you say trade deficits, please do goods and services. Okay, so in the standard data for many countries, bracket India, the trade deficit is counted only on goods. Realistically, there is no difference between goods and services. Okay, you sell a widget, you sell a potato, you sell a haircut, I don't care, you're selling something. So you should only count the trade balance that is computed across goods and services put together. Okay, and that there is an accounting identity that is equal, that deficit on the current account called the current account deficit. It's an accounting identity because if you watch the cash box, I have a shortfall there. It has to be made up by capital inflow. So there's an accounting identity. If capital is coming in the country, I'm running a trade deficit. And if I'm running a trade deficit, capital is coming in the country. And capital is coming in the country to support investment in the country. When investment is more than savings in the country, capital is coming into the country. So my dream for a high growth configuration in India is from the first globalization. Capital should flow downhill. There is infinite capital in advanced economies earning horrible rates of return. So we should be bringing in 10-20% of Indian GDP every year to do investment in India and get high GDP growth. So when anybody complains about the current account deficit, I just fundamentally don't understand it.
Anyone who has watched, I think it was episode 9 of Everything is Everything about how I reverse my type 2 diabetes, will know that no matter how happy I feel at your words, I will not say aapke muh mein ghee shakkar. I will say aapke muh mein ghee. Ghee indeed is a superfood. Avoid shakkar, it is poison.
Yes. Amit, give us recommendations today.
So I'll give you a recommendation and globalization themed because after all that is what we're talking about. And the first book I want to recommend is right here. And I will actually pick up a physical book. I want you to note instead of, looking at my Kindle or looking at my notes. This is a great book called Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann, published, I think, published decades ago, a century ago, at least a century ago, right? And I want to read out something from the first chapter, which is like a classic first chapter, and it's called The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads, right? That's the title again, The World Outside and the Pictures in Our Heads. And he writes, there is an island in the ocean where in 1914 a few Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Germans lived. No cable reaches Red Island, and the British mail steamer comes but once in 60 days. In September, it had not yet come, and the islanders were still talking about the latest newspaper which told about the approaching trial of Madame Queloz for the shooting of Gaston Calmette. It was, therefore, with more than usual eagerness that the whole colony assembled at the quay on a day in mid-September to hear from the captain what the verdict had been. They learned that for over 6 weeks now, those of them who were English and those of them who were French had been fighting on behalf of the sanctity of treaties against those of them who were German. For 6 strange weeks, they acted as if they were friends, when in fact they were enemies. Right? So it's a passage of time. They are at war and they don't know that they are at war for 6 weeks and are behaving normally. And when the First World War ends, exactly the same thing happens, that they don't know that the war is, they're still fighting while the war is actually over and everybody's shaking hands and the leaders are all posing for pictures and the war is, but they are still fighting and they are still killing each other. And so this is Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann is a great book if you want to understand the media, the way the media manipulates us, what we should watch out for, and is published more than 100 years ago and is incredibly prescient. Like no technological change invalidates any of this book. So it's a masterpiece. Got to read it. And that fact about the First World War also reminds me of a Japanese soldier called Hiro Onoda. Have you heard of Hiro Onoda? So Hiro Onoda was a Japanese soldier who at one point in the Second World War, I think circa 1944, landed up in this island in the Philippines where his orders were defend until the death, right? And here's what happened. No one told him the war was over. He was alone on this island. He had to defend it to his death. He followed orders because that is what a good soldier must do. And 29 years later, he discovered the war was over. For 29 years, he was on this island in the Philippines, every day defending the borders and trying to stop intruders. And obviously, it was an isolated island. And that brings me to my second recommendation. The reason I thought of Hiro Onoda when, I read out that story about the First World War is that I first heard of Hiro Onoda in this awesome podcast episode called Supernova in the East, Part 1, by Dan Carlin, and it's from Dan Carlin's great podcast, Hardcore History, perhaps the greatest podcast of all time. And that's my recommendation, not just a podcast, Hardcore History as a whole, but there is a series called Blueprint for Armageddon. And this is about World War One. And it's 6 episodes of about 5 hours each, right? So about 30 hours of content, 25, 30 hours of content. I've forgotten exactly how long it is. And it is just one guy talking. It's Dan Collin talking, and he's practically thinking aloud, and he doesn't read off a script or something. He just got themes he wants to talk about, and he talks about them. And there are no sound effects except the opening packaging right at the start, but there are no sound effects at all. It's just him talking in a conversational way, not in a broadcasty way. And I of course listen at double speed, and that normalizes for me. But I remember I had gone out running. This was back in the days I used to run enthusiastically, and I'd gone out running one day, and I started listening to this, and I finished my 1 hour ka workout routine, and then I couldn't go back up to my apartment. I was standing beneath, and I was just listening. Another day I went out running, it started raining, I stayed outside. And that was the day he was speaking about a bunch of soldiers who died in a particular battle. And the night before they died, all of them sent letters to their wives or girlfriends. And they didn't know they were going to die. They just knew they were going to battle. And they all wrote letters to their wives and girlfriends. And he read out these letters. And I was weeping in the rain. And it is so powerful. And I think listening to Hardcore History, listening to Blueprint for Armageddon, really drove home to me the power of audio and the power of storytelling. That you don't need anything special. You just need a story, and you just need to talk about it. And there's nothing beyond that. And that is primal. That was our first entertainment. We had no music
Yeah.
back in the day, no television, no web series, no binge watching, nothing. We had stories we could tell each other. Audio is the most powerful medium in the world. And, listening to Hardcore History, listening to Blueprint for Armageddon, not only taught me many lessons about the World War, about the Great War, as it were, World War One, but also taught me lessons about humanity, about resilience, about character, about tragedy, about the folly of nation states. But it also taught me a lesson about the power of audio. And I think that since we are doing a video podcast, that's a great note to end on.
I have a story that is slightly similar, which I was reminded of. There's a book, Seizing the Enigma. We'll put the information in the show notes. I was standing in Strand Bookstall in Bombay, and at random I bumped into the book. So I opened it. I started reading the first 1 or 2 pages. I said, "Okay, this works." So I bought the book. Then I was leaving Strand Bookstall, and I was supposed to go back to go back to Bandra. And this was in rush hour. So, the sooner you left, the sooner you would reach home. You
Strand is
would
at the
beat
tip
the,
of South Bombay.
yeah, you would beat the rush hour. But the first 2 pages that I had read had just left me in a transfixed position. So I stepped out of the bookshop, and I sort of wandered aimlessly for a little bit of time. Then I gave up, and I said, I can't do this any other way. So I just found a local Irani shop, and I sat there till 9 p.m. and I read the whole book. I just couldn't do anything else. It was just the first 2 pages caught me so badly, I couldn't do anything else. The only one life I could imagine at that moment was to drop everything and sit in an Irani shop and finish the book.
This is the life to live.
This is the good life.